voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
The Speaker of the National People's Assembly and President of the Arab Interparliamentary Union, Mr. Brahim Boughali, has reiterated his call to the international community and organizations to adopt firm positions with regard to the Israeli violations against civilians in Palestine and Lebanon. The Polisario Front's representative to the United Nations and coordinator with MINURSO, Sidi Mohamed Omar, blamed the current situation in the Western Sahara conflict on the UN Security Council for shifting the Sahrawi cause from a decolonization issue to an issue of political settlement. And as the Lebanese government condemned the evacuation of Lebanon's southern part ordered by the Israeli occupation, the area is still targeted by intense airstrikes. Those were the major developments. Now the full news edition. I'm Essia Bakar. Good afternoon. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization Forum Bridge for Cities 2024, held in Vienna under the theme Innovative Solutions for the Cities of Tomorrow, has highlighted Algeria's efforts in housing, urban development and international cooperation. Mariam Barshi has the details.
Speaking as a panelist, the governor of the province of Annaba, Abdelkader Jalawi, who represented Algeria at the event held recently, stressed the importance of dialogue and the exchange of ideas and proposals to find solutions adapted to urban challenges, highlighting the strategies of the various national programs initiated by the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, with particular emphasis on priority sectors such as employment, housing, transport services, waste management and energy consumption. Mr. Jalawi highlighted Algeria's effort in the housing sector with more than 2 million housing units built until 2024 and a similar target set under the 2025-2029 five-year program. In this regard, he highlighted the social impact of the housing sector, which contributes to the elimination of poverty, the creation of jobs, and the promotion of investment in the construction sector, while specifying that the production of the necessary materials is done locally at competitive prices thanks to the reduced cost of energy and the skilled workforce trained locally in vocational training centers.
The Speaker of the National People's Assembly and President of the Arab Interparliamentary Union, Mr. Brahim Boughali, has reiterated his call to the international community and regional and international organizations to adopt firm positions with regard to the barbaric Zionist violations and practices against civilians in Palestine and Lebanon and impose deterrent legal measures. The details with Mohammed Khatel.
Speaking at the coordination meeting of the Arab Parliamentary Group held on the sidelines of the 149th session of the Inter-Parliamentary Union IPU, Mr. Boughali affirmed that the exceptional and unprecedented circumstances imposed by the usurping Zionist entity must prompt us to show more solidarity and reaffirm our inalienable position in favor of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. The Speaker of the lower house of Parliament insisted that the meeting came at a critical time for the Arab nation and the Palestinian cause, adding that the duty requires full preparation to face and address all the significant challenges and threats that Arab and Muslim nations are confronted with. He also emphasized the imperative of exploiting all available platforms and activating our parliamentary diplomacy at all levels for coordination and collective action with other Islamic, Asian, African and Latin American groups, as well as with all countries supporting the Palestinian cause through the adoption of an emergency clause that the Arab group will submit as a symbolic step reflecting the awakening of human conscience through the voice of the peoples in this parliamentary platform and the support for the right against injustice and oppression. Mr. Boughali underlined on the occasion that the responsibility of parliamentarians is not limited to legislating, but goes beyond it to reach the protection of human dignity and the achievement of justice.
And the third edition of the International Youth Forum for Solidarity with Western Sahara, held in Bilbao, Spain, under the theme Youth Building Bridges for a Free Western Sahara, has continued for the third and last day. And Majid Mila has the details.
The presentation of the conclusions and the final declaration were on today's agenda, which also include discussions on such issues as the geopolitics of Western Sahara, the role of young women in conflict resolution, empowering voices on the way to freedom, and silenced voices, stories from Western Sahara and the media blockade. A forum organized by the Polisario Front Youth Union hosted around 220 participants, including international youth organizations, representatives of political parties, and friends of the Sahrawi people from 30 countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. It aimed to strengthen dialogue on the challenges facing the Sahrawi question while providing a platform for the exchange of ideas and initiatives between participants, thereby helping to strengthen international solidarity with the struggle of the Sahrawi people. In the same context, the Algerian representatives of the Higher Youth Council have called on Sahrawi youth in Bilbao, Spain, to get inspired of the Algerian youth who waged in the glorious war of national liberation.
A member of the Decolonial Liberation Front, Assil Benachi, said during the forum that the decision of the French president only formalizes and clarifies France's action in favor of Morocco and shows once again that the occupation of Western Sahara, which is unjust, illegal and inhuman, is supported by the greatest imperialist powers in the world. He was commented about the autonomy plan. The Polisario Front's representative to the United Nations and coordinator with MINURSO, Sidi Mohamed Omar, blamed the current situation in Western Sahara on the UN Security Council for shifting the Sahrawi cause from the decolonization issue to an issue of political settlement. Speaking at the Youth Forum in solidarity with Western Sahara held in the Spanish city of Bilbao, Sidi Mohamed Omar emphasized that we should see the reality as it is and address it accordingly.
Very briefly, I will tell you that regardless of the international recognition of Western Sahara as a decolonization issue, the big problem lies in the Security Council. It is the Council that has contributed to the state of affairs that we have now by shifting through a series of terminologies the sense of the gravity of the process from a decolonization issue to a mutually political solution based on all these ambiguous terms of realism, practicability, and so on and so forth. So this is the reality as we see it. Someone may say that, so where can we go from here? One thing is to be aware of the reality, and one thing is to see how to deal with this reality. And I think that the Sahrawi people have shown all along that they're able to deal with this reality. Why and on what basis? As Obi was saying, we have justice, we have legality on our side.
And that was the Polisario Front's representative to the United Nations and coordinator with MINURSO. The member of the Algerian National People's Assembly has stressed in Geneva, Switzerland, the need to mobilize their efforts and to focus on the emergency clause regarding Palestine. Attending the working committee held as part of the 149th General Assembly of the Interparliamentary Union, Algeria's representative is taking part in the meeting held as part of coordination of the Arab Parliamentary Group. The meeting was presided over by the chairman of the Omani Consultative Council in his capacity as chairman of the committee made up of Algeria, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, and Oman. To the Middle East, the Israeli occupation has intensified its attacks on various parts of the Gaza Strip, killing scores of people. Palestinian sources affirmed that over 50 people were killed and more than 120 others in the Israeli airstrikes that mainly targeted the northern area of Jabalia. Majid Mira.
According to the same sources considered reliable by the UN, over 42,227 people have been killed since the Israeli army launched its large-scale operations on the enclave 1 year ago. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, at least 30 Palestinians were arrested during operations carried out by the Israeli occupying forces in Beit Lahem, Hebron, Jenin, Nablus, and Ramallah. The news agency Wafa stated that several houses were seriously damaged during the operations. The number of Palestinians arrested since the Israeli launched its operations on Gaza has increased to reach 11,200. In the meantime, the Palestinian Foreign Ministry has hailed Nicaragua's decision to break up its diplomatic relation with Israel in response to the continued massacres and destruction perpetrated in the occupied Palestinian territories. It said the decision expresses the country's major responsibility to take concrete measures to end the ongoing aggression and guarantee the people's right to live in peace and dignity.
You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and the United Nations Children's Fund UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell has stressed that the lives of children in Palestine and Lebanon are being torn apart in unimaginable ways. More with Marine Barshi.
UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell said in a statement that tens of thousands of children have died and thousands more are in captivity, displaced, orphaned, out of school and suffering from trauma as a result of violence and war, calling for the protection of civilians, including children, humanitarian workers and civilians' infrastructure, such as schools and health facilities. Mrs. Russell also called for an unhindered access to the vital aid, stressing that these obligations are clearly being violated. Describing the death and suffering of children as shameful, she said that the daily bloodshed and horrors inflicted on children were an affront to the most fundamental values of humanity. She went on to say that violence against children, and as she put it, the most vulnerable among us, must stop. Despite the UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, the Israeli occupation has been pursuing a brutal offensive against the Gaza Strip since October 7, 2023, resulting in more than 42,200 martyrs, mainly women and children, and more than 98,300 wounded, while in Lebanon more than 2,255 people have been killed.
Norwegian Foreign Minister has stressed that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is deteriorating dramatically as a result of the continuous Israeli attacks for over a year. The Norwegian official said that the Israeli occupation continues to hinder the access to humanitarian aid in the Palestinian enclave. The head of the Norwegian diplomacy said that Palestinians in Gaza have been living in fear of death and destruction for over a year, and that the humanitarian situation in the enclave is deteriorating considerably. He also stressed that a ceasefire must first be reached in Gaza and that obstacles to the flow of humanitarian aid must be lifted. Tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters have taken to the streets in major European cities and around the globe to call for ceasefire in Gaza and the Middle East region. In Rome, several thousands demonstrated peacefully, chanting "Free Palestine, Free Lebanon," waving Palestinian flags and holding banners calling for an immediate stop to the conflict. The president of the Palestinian community in Rome, Youssef Salman, who took part in the demonstrations, said people in Gaza and the Middle East in general have had enough of destruction and peace should be imposed immediately.
All
the friends of Palestine went to the streets to say no to this war of destruction and yes to peace. We want peace that is based on justice, peace that guarantees the legal rights of the Palestinians as stipulated by all the resolutions of the United Nations and the international legality. We came to say no to the massacre of the Palestinian people and no to the massacre of the Lebanese people as well. No to the Israeli bombing and destruction in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and everywhere. We've had enough of destruction and of the impartial and colonial support to the criminal ruling government in Israel, because since October 7, the United States of America have provided Israel with $76 billion and gave them more than 50,000 tons of bombs and missiles to destroy Palestine and Lebanon and the Arab world.
Meanwhile, thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters in Brisbane, Australia, called on the federal government to demand a ceasefire in the Middle East. The protest was one of the largest seen in the city since the Israeli aggression started a year ago. The protesters also asked the Australian government to sanction the Israeli occupation and to stop supplying weapons and ammunition for the war. And as the Lebanese government condemned the evacuation of Lebanon's southern part ordered by the Israeli occupation, the area is still targeted by intense airstrikes. The news agency ANI said that the airstrikes hit a market in a town and caused considerable damage. The Health Ministry affirmed that the Israeli occupying forces have ordered the evacuation of about 25 southern localities and villages. According to the UN, the Israeli attacks on Lebanon, which have stepped up over the past days, have caused thousands of families to flee their homes. This came as Pope Francis affirmed that the UNIFIL forces deployed in Lebanon must be respected, saying that he feels himself close to all the people involved in the Middle East, insisting that war will never bring peace but will bring defeat for the whole world. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and still with a statement of Pope Francis. His call followed a call made by the UN Security Council's 10 elected members, known as the E10 group, for an end to be put to Israel's attacks. They recalled that any deliberate attack carried out against peacekeepers constituted a serious violation of the international humanitarian law and of UN Resolution 1701. The UN Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, told the Security Council that the devastating conflict in Lebanon, coupled with intensified strikes in Syria and the raging violence in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, points to a region dangerously teetering on the brink of an all-out war. She urged the parties to commit to return to a cessation of hostilities and to the full implementation of Security Resolution 1701.
Over 300 people have been killed in Lebanon in just the past week. Since 8 October last year, the number of dead is now over 2,000, according to Lebanese Ministry of Health. Hundreds of those killed were civilians, including more than 100 children. Lebanese Armed Forces personnel have been killed, with 3 fatalities in the past week. Over 600 people have been displaced in Lebanon, 250,000 people since last Wednesday. The vast majority are women and children. A quarter of Lebanese territory has been placed under so-called evacuation orders affecting more than 100 villages and neighborhoods, giving people as little as 2 hours' notice to vacate their homes, often in the middle of the night. Around 250,000 people, including Lebanese and Syrians, have fled into Syria. Tens of thousands more have departed through Beirut airport. Lebanon's health sector is under immense pressure. Many hospitals and centers closed following airstrikes hitting healthcare facilities and personnel. The flash appeal, launched last week, requests $425 million to assist 1 million people over the next 3 months. I urge member states to support this request. And I thank those of you who have already given or pledged aid.
That was a statement made by the UN Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, at the Security Council. That's it, dear listeners, for our news bulletin. Now, the headlines. The Speaker of the National People's Assembly and President of the Arab Interparliamentary Union, Mr. Brahim Boughali, has reiterated his call to the international community and organization to adopt firm positions with regard to the barbaric Israeli violations against civilians in Palestine and Lebanon. The Polisario Front's representative to the United Nations and coordinator with MINURSO, Sidi Mohammed Omar, blamed the current situation in the Western Sahara conflict on the UN Security Council for shifting the Sahrawi cause from a decolonization issue to an issue of political settlement. And as the Lebanese government condemned the evacuation of Lebanon's southern parts ordered by the Israeli occupation, the area is still targeted by intense airstrikes. 2:15 minutes Algiers time. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and I invite you now to listen to the international event of the week.
The international event of the week.
Lebanon's southern part was again hit this week by intense Israeli attacks that also targeted the southern suburb of Beirut, causing casualties and major damage. The Israeli airstrikes hit several towns of Lebanon's southern Bekaa Valley amid ground operations taking place in the country's southwestern part. Hundreds of people have been killed since the Israeli army launched its operation on Lebanon 3 weeks ago. The deadly airstrikes displaced about 1.2 million people across the country, whereas 200,000 others have crossed the border into Syria, including Syrian and Palestinian refugees. Asked on whether the expansion by the Israeli army of its ground operations, described by observers as a high-intensity offensive, was just a prelude to Israel's scheme to occupy southern Lebanon, our California-based political analyst Hamoud Salhi had this to say.
The Israeli military objectives are to occupy southern Lebanon, as evidenced by its deployment of 4 military divisions as of now. The orders to civilians, Lebanese civilians, to evacuate areas beyond the United Nations declared buffer zone. According to Israeli officials, a military operation is limited, designed to ensure the return of the thousands of Israelis to northern Israel. According to scholars and experts from the region, Israel's other goals in Lebanon is to ignite a civil war against Hezbollah, destroying Lebanese infrastructure, and pursue a like Gaza genocide invasion in Lebanon. However, Israelis are fully aware they cannot defeat Hezbollah. Therefore, they are restoring to create chaos and increase social tensions, capitalizing on an already dire economic conditions and political crisis that have been in Lebanon for quite some time now.
This week, Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister Najib Mikati said that diplomatic efforts intensified ahead a UN Security Council session to try and reach a temporary ceasefire in Lebanon. In a statement released by his office, he assured that contacts were underway to try and secure a ceasefire and pave the way for political solutions, while insisting that Israel must be forced to cease its destructive aggression. Asked about the objective of Israel's pronged operations in the region, our political analyst Professor Hamoud Salhi had the following.
The Israeli invasion of Lebanon declared objectives are to remove Hezbollah military threat, to enable the returns of the Israelis to northern Israel, and to eliminate Hezbollah's leadership and destroy infrastructure in the entire Lebanon, including Beirut. But these are no more than tactical objectives, tools designed to achieve the Israeli grand strategy against Iran and the Palestinian resistance. The Israeli design is to undercut the Iranian strategic depth in the region and weaken the Palestinian resistance by going after its natural allies, Hezbollah, and for that matter, other movements that are actively supporting Palestinian resistance in Gaza, including those in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. The ultimate Israeli goal is to create chaos in the region by forcing Iran to resort to force defending itself, and subsequently, along that goal, is to force the United States to intervene against Iran, drawing it to a war, and that will be manifested all over the region, with the United States using the pretext that is doing so, and it is involved in this conflict, to defend its Zionist ally in the region.
This week, tens of thousands of people rallied around the world calling for a ceasefire in Lebanon and in Gaza to mark the year of a genocidal war on the Palestinian territory. The event shed light on the atrocities perpetrated by the Israeli occupying forces against the civilian population in Gaza and marked the beginning of a second year of suffering, destruction and despair. Asked if the Israeli premier is playing for time, taking advantage of the US electoral agenda to reinforce Israel's presence in both Gaza and Lebanon, taking the risk to plunge the whole region into chaos, our political analyst Hamid Salhi commented the issue.
No doubt, Prime Minister Netanyahu is using the American elections to expand the Israeli occupation in Palestine, Lebanon, and possibly to other areas in the region. This is both for personal self-serving agendas and to execute the agenda of the far-right terrorists who form his cabinet. Netanyahu knows very well that the survival of his political career depends on him staying at war and extending it as much as he can. The other thing is that the ultra-right know this very well and are using leverage against him to force him to continue doing what he is doing. The timing of the elections could not be better for Netanyahu, as he is able to gain now leverage against attempt to stop him from doing from committing the genocide act. And this is by holding firm of the support of the Israeli lobby. This made it, the support by the Israeli lobby and the impact they have on the American elections, made it possible for him to align the United States beside him under the false claim that Israel is under an existential threat from Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. As a result, the elections made it possible for Netanyahu to have on record both Democrats and Republican candidates endorsing him fully, endorsing his genocide action, in fact. This is despite the harm that is causing to America strategic interest in the region and its image worldwide. It is possible that following the elections we may see a different U.S. approach. In particular, the Democrat could take a strong stand against Israel, forcing him to stop his act. This is because they will no longer be under the pressure of the Israeli lobby. However, should they lose the elections, they may consider staying idle, doing nothing, simply to pass the crisis to the new leader, hence presumably setting him for failure. In other words, we may witness another Afghan-like scenario. But for now, Netanyahu is using his leverage with the International Court of Justice, the World Criminal Court, the human rights associations, and the world public opinion and the entire world populations. He's using his leverage to get away with a genocide.
The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, called for an urgent ceasefire in Lebanon to prevent a humanitarian crisis in the country. During a visit to Beirut, he stressed that the international law must be respected while highlighting the need to provide greater support and aid to the distressed population in Lebanon.
مع إذاعة الجزائر الدولية لن تفوتكم لحظة واحدة من الأخبار السياسية والاقتصادية الهامة. إذاعة الجزائر الدولية، صوتنا في العالم. استمعوا إلينا لنقل المعلومات من مصادرها الرسمية وتفسير حي للأحداث في حصص تحليلية مميزة. إذاعة الجزائر الدولية، صوتنا في العالم.
إذاعة الجزائر الدولية تنقل إليكم صوت الجزائر، تضعكم في الصورة وترسم لكم الطريق عبر محللين مختصين ومراسليها في العالم. الجزائر الدولية، صوتنا في العالم.
Sintonizan Radio Argelia Internacional. El diario hablado.
Vayamos con los titulares de nuestra edición. El presidente de la República, Abdelmajid Tebboune, recibe a la presidenta de la India, Draupadi Murmu, quien está efectuando a partir de hoy una visita de Estado a Argelia de 4 días de duración. Los participantes en el tercer foro de la Juventud para la Solidaridad con el pueblo saharaui manifiestan su apoyo a la autodeterminación